Okay, so we've gone over basic Freudian theory, structure of the personality, the organization of the personality, um, the development, very briefly, the development of the personality. Now we're going to talk uh, in terms, to some degree, in terms of the function of the personality, how the how the ego manages things that are problematic both from within in terms of instinctual urges, memories, these kinds of things, and uh, things, external things, things that are anxiety provoking from the outside world. So we'll talk about the ways in which the mechanisms by which the ego defends itself, defense mechanisms. Normally I would go through kind of a quick refresher, but we just hit these things. If you have any questions about them, please send me an email, get in touch with me, let me know, and we can go over them. Okay, so as I was saying before, defense mechanisms are the strategies that the ego uses to balance the demands of reality, of the superego, and of the id. So you've got the tension between instinctual urges on the one hand and the demands of reality on the other, between which the ego is trying to find some reasonable compromise. And then it also has the pressure from the superego, the incorporation of the ideas of morality, the do's and don'ts. And so you got the tension between this compromise approach that the ego is seeking between reality and instinctual urges, and then the additional pressure of the demands of morality. So when we say strategies that the ego uses, what we're talking about here are cognitive processes. Generally speaking, the cognitive processes are at least initially unconscious. We certainly can become aware of them. That's actually part of the reason why we do psychotherapy, is to help people become aware of kind of the patterns of behavior that can be problematic for them. And as we go through the various defense mechanisms, hopefully that the ways in which they can be problematic will become more apparent. The term defense mechanisms, because we think of defensiveness in a negative sense, it might be it would be an understandable initial reaction to think of defense mechanisms as something bad or something negative. They are in fact not at all. They can be problematic, and again, as we go through, you'll see examples of how and why. But defense mechanisms themselves are neither good nor bad. It's a matter of the context, a matter of how they're being used, a matter of how healthy the ego is that is implementing them. Again, this may not make a lot of sense to you until we actually get talking about defense mechanisms specifically. But one thing to keep in mind is that these defense mechanisms are preferences for particular defense mechanisms. A group of particular defense mechanisms are no small part of what we think of as personality. The ways in which we seek to protect ourselves, to manage our anxiety, to manage our problematic urges. And I'll just give you a very quick example. One of the defense mechanisms that we'll talk about is humor. Somebody who manages perhaps aggressive urges, perhaps their own fears, by finding humor in them. Well, very clearly that's a classic example of the ways in which defense mechanisms present as and are part of personality. So as I alluded to just a second ago, the mechanisms, the defense mechanisms, while there are some that are essentially universal, and we'll talk about those as we go, the preference that an individual has for a particular defense mechanism or defense mechanisms is largely the result of four factors. Temperament, so your inborn inclinations, how aggressive are you? How internally or externally focused are you? How energetic or passive are you? These things that have clear genetically loaded physiological bases. In addition to temperament, early childhood stresses, circumstances. I'll give you an example, and these four factors tend to overlap. So this example might also be thought of in terms of reinforcement or punishment and defenses encouraged or discouraged by caregivers. But say you, thinking back to our discussion of the Freudian developmental theory, say you have a child that is temperamentally very strong-willed, very energetic, very forceful. Not at all surprising that a child like that would be born to parents, at least one of whom is probably like that. And say these parents are not particularly psychologically minded. And so the child enters into, the 18th month to the 24th month, somewhere between the first and the second birthday. And they're kind of moving into toilet training, because the child is very strong-willed and the parents are very strong-willed, and parents aren't particularly psychologically minded, not recognizing that, you got to win the war. The kid has to become toilet trained, but it's a healthy thing to let the child win some battles and choose the short-term course of how the toilet training proceeds. But these parents, strong-willed as they are, dismayed at least by their toddler's stubbornness, really push hard to control the child, to control the child's toileting. We talked about some of the reasons, that some of the motivating factors for that kind of behavior for parents. But you can see not just not just centered around the toilet training, but probably in a household like that, all sorts of points of contention between what the child wants and what the parents want. You can see how that would shape the way the child responds to his or her, tries to manage or not manage his or her own impulses, instincts, urges, that sort of thing. Similarly, when we talked about Oedipal or phallic stage identification with each of the parents, most particularly the same-sex parent, one of the things we talked about was that sense of identification. Identification is a defense mechanism that we're going to talk about. But in identifying with a parent, one of the things that we tend to do is internalize that parent's, or at least some of that parent's, strategies for managing their own impulses. Is mom particular? Does dad use humor? Is mom passive aggressive? And to the degree that those things are integral to the parent's personality, to the degree that they are perceived by the child as being relatively effective ways of managing circumstances or one's own urges, they likely, without even the child realizing it, are being internalized, identified with. So, temperament, early childhood stress, the defenses that other people model or encourage, or in some cases discourage, things that are reinforced and punished. I may have already alluded to this. We're going to go over a fairly limited, reasonably large number, but in the grand scheme of things, limited um, set of examples of basic defense mechanisms. What we're going to be covering really are the ones that are most common, things that you see in most people, and some of the defense mechanisms from which other more subtle or situational strategies may arise. So you can have, I mean, basically any way that you can imagine that a person, any psychological strategy that a person might use to control themselves, to resist awareness of things that are unpleasant for them or threatening to them psychologically or in some cases even physically. Anything you can imagine there, hypothetically, could be a defense mechanism, a strategy for managing these things. So we'll start with the most basic defense, the defense that in a way is kind of the foundation for all the other defenses, and that is unconscious motivated forgetting, repression. It's hard to, I think I may have mentioned it earlier this semester because it's hard to begin talking about the personality. It's hard to begin talking about individual internal life without at least talking around the idea that we sometimes hide things from ourselves intentionally but unconsciously, not realizing that we're doing it. And it is the earliest of the defenses arising before even Freudian sense, full consciousness, the development of the ego fully, these sorts of things. And Freud distinguishes between two basic types of repression, what he called primal repression and then repression proper, which nobody calls repression proper, they just call it repression. Primal repression is built into our psyche. And what I mean by that is, Freud thought about it as there are some things, some instinctual urges that are so problematic, that are so universally intolerable in any civilized group of people that they cannot be allowed ever to emerge. And so he believed that as a group, essentially, that our minds, by default, we don't ever allow these urges the light of day, so to speak. And these are the things that we talk of and we think of as taboos. He talked about these things, this primal repression being derived from racial experience, and he's not talking about racial experience in terms of black, white, Asian, these kinds of things. What he's talking about is the human race, and he's arguing that over the course of the eons of human existence, there are urges that are so consistently unacceptable across all cultures that we develop almost as a basic way that our minds function, the repression, there's another way to say it, the repression of that urge. Anything, and he pointed out, anything that's taboo. I think I said this to you earlier this semester, the idea that Freud pointed out that you don't have to have a taboo against something unless there is some underlying urge in that direction, right? The implication of this is the taboo, say, against incest, against sex among first-degree relatives. He was arguing if there's no urge present for that, you don't have to make it against the rules. And using that as an example, what he was arguing is that this has been problematic ever since we started living in groups, which of course the first groups were family groups, and sexual contact between first-degree relatives can be incredibly destructive to any attempt to live together. And so he was saying, as we emerged from the other animals, eons and eons ago, there were certain things that were so problematic to our efforts to live together and take care of each other and mutually survive, that they have been so consistently and for so long, put away psychologically, that the repression becomes primal. It becomes something that's kind of programmed into us from the outset. And then the secondary, and the way we generally talk about repression, is repression proper. And this is that unconscious, intentional forcing of a memory or an idea or an impulse out of awareness. So it's holding down in the unconscious knowledge of certain instincts or urges or impulses or awareness of things externally, say. And I don't know whether I mentioned this to you earlier this semester, but the classic example of repression, the essentially universal experience, is awakening in the morning. I'm pretty certain I did mention this to you. Awakening in the morning from a dream. And the dream is particularly vivid and interesting, and you think to yourself, oh, I got to go tell whoever, I got to go tell mom, or I got to go tell my brother or my friend or whomever. I got to go tell them about this dream. And you get up and you brush your teeth and you get yourself dressed and you go out of your room and down the hall, and by the time you run into whoever it is you were going to tell about the dream, you open your mouth to tell them and you go, because you realize that this dream that 15 minutes ago was vivid and rich and emotionally engaging has somehow faded from your memory. It's not available anymore. Perhaps pieces of it are, fragments of it, but that intense dream composition seems to have been forgotten. And if you take a step back and you think about it, that doesn't make any sense unless you have some sort of damage. Your memory isn't that poor. And what Freud pointed out, that is part of the whole dream problem when you're dealing with dreams in psychotherapy, is that this is one of the I guess I need to mention this. Dreams, in the Freudian sense, are essentially the strategies that the ego uses. When you go to sleep, the ego largely goes, using computer language, largely goes offline. Of course, it never shuts down completely, because ego function is part of what rouses you from sleep if you need to urinate. It's part of what rouses you from sleep if somebody comes in the room and says your name, or you hear a suspicious sound in the middle of the night, or you smell smoke in the middle of the night. The ego is not completely offline, but it is, of course, mostly significantly offline, in the sense that attention is withdrawn from the world and turned inward. And this is partly because, well, obviously you need rest. There is a psychological component to the restoration that you get from sleep. And the mind, the ego, the brain, is involved in in other activities while you're asleep, largely memory consolidation among some other things. So the watchfulness of the ego, Freud argued, in sleep is diminished. And when that happens, the urges and desires and instincts that the ego works very hard to keep contained, to keep managed, begin to metaphorically rise to the surface. Because that is the nature of an instinct, right? If you're hungry, that hunger is going to constantly seek to assert itself. Now you can distract yourself from that hunger, but the hunger is constantly pushing to get recognized and dealt with. It wants you to eat some food so you're not hungry anymore, so the tension is dissipated. That is the nature of the instincts, of these urges that have been repressed, that have been held in the unconscious. So you go to sleep, and the ego goes largely offline, and when it does, the efforts that it uses to contain these impulses are relaxed. The impulses, the instincts, begin to do as they do naturally, and that is that they begin to move toward consciousness. And when this is recognized by the largely slumbering ego, rather than rousing itself completely to reestablish control, Freud hypothesized that what it does is it slightly modifies the urge. It disguises the urge, whatever that urge, problematic, frightening, anxiety-provoking urge might be. It disguises it, and that's where you get the stories that are dreams. And of course, we talked earlier about primary and secondary process thought processes, and when you're largely offline and largely or more unconscious, let's say, because the higher level functions of the ego are offline while you're asleep, the disguising that the deep ego is doing to the instincts that are arising, turning them into a dream, has the clear imprint of primary process, right? Of those deeply unconscious processes that go on at a primitive level in your brain. I think we did talk about the similarity between dream material and primary process as described in class. And I just lost my train of thought. Yeah. So this primary process level of functioning in the deep unconscious of the ego, rather than rousing itself into full awareness, so secondary process, logical, rational, language-based processing, rather than having that happen, which means you're awake, what ends up happening in Freud's theory is that this lower level, more deeply or more unconscious way that the ego also functions manages the dream by disguising it, turning it into metaphor, so that it is not as apparent to the conscious ego what exactly the content is about. And of course, if that disguise is inadequate, then what happens is that the nature of the material becomes too close to the truth, becomes frightening. You have a nightmare and you wake up. Primary or secondary process is reestablished, and the full repression can take place. And then, of course, the same thing or a similar thing happens if the dream is effective. It's not frightening. It may be a little weird. It may be kind of perplexing and puzzling. That's good in the Freudian model of things. You wake up, and if you're thinking about the dream, like, oh, what did that mean? This happened and that happened, and this, the story went this way, and the ego is like, nope, we're not doing this. We're not going to look at this too closely, because if we look at this too closely, the possibility that we're going to uncover the things that I really don't want to be thinking about is there. So repression is reestablished and those things are pushed back down into the unconscious. But we've all had that experience of waking up, vivid dream, 15, 20 minutes later, the dream is almost all completely gone. Repression is a very fundamental, relatively primitive strategy, but it is also essentially universal. Essentially everybody, not essentially, everybody uses it regularly. The problem is it takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy. There is a similar mechanism, which we're going to talk about later, called suppression. And suppression is the same thing as repression, it's just conscious. So you have a thought or an urge that you perceive as undesirable, as unlike you, and you have that kind of that shiver, that reaction of, oh, don't think that. You want to do something horrible to somebody that you care about, or I think I may have told you the story about dropping my kids off when they were young at the bus stop and having the thought of, what if something should happen to them? What if they don't come home from school? What if somebody kidnaps them? Some terrible thought like that. And the reaction that I would have inevitably to that thought when it would come into my head is that, oh God, don't think about that, because it's too tormenting, right? So you intentionally turn your attention, you intentionally turn your attention away from the thought. That is suppression. The difference between suppression, conscious intentionally pushing something out of awareness, and repression is that the repression is unconscious, suppression is conscious. Why was I telling you that? There was a reason I was telling you that. The reason I was telling you that is because you can imagine, or you can recognize very easily that suppression requires a lot of effort. If you have something that is, anybody who has anxiety can tell you this. Your brain goes somewhere you don't want it to go, and you start worrying about something, and you tell yourself, stop thinking about this. And so you make an effort to push it out of your head. You know how hard that can be. It takes a tremendous amount of energy and effort to get your mind turned away from something that is anxiety provoking. Well, that's the case even if you're not aware that you're doing it. If you're repressing, you may not be aware of the effort that you're expending to hold it out of awareness. But there is that effort, there is that energy, and it can be very preoccupying. Somebody who relies heavily on repression often appears fairly low energy, worn out, distractible, these kinds of things, because there's so much effort going into managing the repression. Oh, sorry, I forgot that I had this slide. So, talking about how inefficient it is, talking about the people who use repression to the large exclusion of other strategies, tending to be rigid, tense, tired, easily overwhelmed, that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about the rest of the defenses from that perspective. To what degree are they energy efficient, or conversely, to what degree do they not work particularly well, in the sense that they require a lot of effort and a lot of energy to remain in place. So defense mechanisms that are significantly energy consuming and require a lot of effort, we're going to talk about them as primary or primitive, less effective defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms that don't require so much energy, and if you're wondering how in the world would that work, when we get to them it'll begin to make sense. But secondary and higher order defense mechanisms are referred to as that because they are more efficient and because they're reality based. So something like humor. Relatively, humor can be a relatively higher order defense, particularly to the degree that it acknowledges indirectly, but acknowledges the pain that underlies much of the humor. If you ever saw the old television show MASH about the field hospital unit in the Korean War, funny show, but consistently looking at fairly dark subject matter and seeing humor in fairly dark subject matter. One of the funniest clips from any movie ever, arguably, the Black Knight scene from the Holy Grail, Monty Python's The Holy Grail, where King Arthur confronts the Black Knight, and the Black Knight refuses to let him pass, and they have a sword fight, and in the sword fight, King Arthur methodically dismembers the Black Knight, and they argue as he's doing it, with the Black Knight ending up without arms and legs and continuing to threaten King Arthur. Very dark, very funny. In fact, if you look closely at most humor, that is the nature of humor. So that would be an example of a relatively higher order defense mechanism. It's not completely ignoring or hiding from the pain. It's acknowledging it indirectly and seeing some humor in it, finding some reason to laugh in it, to make the terror, the pain more tolerable. As opposed to the primitive defense mechanisms that are not reality-based. We'll talk about denial in just a second. Denial is just very straightforward. Nope, I'm not dealing with it. Something is happening in the world that is for some reason intolerable, and I'm not dealing with it. I'm going to pretend like that's not the case. So I have here that the primary or primitive defense mechanisms are marked by a lack of appreciation of the reality principle and lack of appreciation of the separateness and constancy of those outside the self, which is an extension of that lack of appreciation of reality. The lack of appreciation of the separateness and constancy of those outside the self really is a reflection of just how primitive some of the defense mechanisms are. Because if you think about it, that reflects very, very, very early ego development. Before, as the ego is developing, the boundary between self and other isn't clear for the infant and the toddler. Okay. So we'll start first with primitive withdrawal. And as I said before, so this is keep in mind, we're starting off with primary defense mechanisms. These first several that we're going to go through are defense mechanisms that don't work particularly well because they require either a significant amount of energy to maintain them, or they are in direct ignorance or ignoring of reality, and so you constantly have to work to maintain them. That all being said, we all use multiple primary defense mechanisms daily, and primitive withdrawal, psychological withdrawal into a different state of consciousness, escaping reality, would be a great example of this. I'll give you a really very, very straightforward example of primitive withdrawal that I find myself doing. I get really stressed. I get sleepy, which I know is very strange, right? You wouldn't expect that would be the case. You get stressed, your heart rate increases, you get nervous, you start to worry. If it's something that I can't do a lot about, I'll find myself wanting to go to sleep. That's primitive withdrawal. It's an escape. Some people use chemicals, drugs or alcohol, as a way of escaping their pain. Others, maybe most of us, I mean, who hasn't come home from a bad day and, either vegged out in front of the television, or, played video games or computer games, or gotten in, escape into a book. Similarly, you see this with, I suppose everybody does, or I suppose you see this across both sexes, but this is particularly associated with being a guy. Men are notorious for having a medical problem and refusing to go to a doctor about it, as if just ignoring the problem will somehow make it go away, or somehow make it not a problem. So all of these things are examples of primitive withdrawal. One of the things that's characteristic, and again, it's a primitive defense mechanism, or a primary defense mechanism, because one, it doesn't work very well long term, right? If you ignore the problem, at minimum it doesn't go away, and in the worst case scenario, it might be a dragon, right? If you've never read the kids' book, There's No Such Thing as Dragons. That book, which is a little boy wakes up in the morning. It's been years and years and years since I've read this, so I may be off in some of the details, but roughly, little boy wakes up in the morning and finds in his room a tiny little dragon. And he goes downstairs and gets dressed and brushes his teeth, and he goes downstairs and says to Mom, "Mom, guess what? There's a dragon in my room." And Mom says, "There's no such thing as a dragon." And as she says that, the boy sees that the dragon gets a little bit bigger. And every time he tries to convince his mom, and I think for some reason, I want to say the teacher at school, and every time he tries to talk to an adult about this dragon that he has found, and they say, "There's no such thing as a dragon," the dragon gets a little bit bigger, and a little bit bigger, and a little bit bigger. And eventually, 3/4 of the way through the story, adults have been saying this, as the kid is continually pointing out the dragon, and the dragon now has gotten to the point where it's so big that its wings are coming out the side windows, and its head is coming out the upper story, and its legs are coming out the front door and other windows, like it's filled the house, right? And I forget exactly what the interaction is where it resolves, but eventually an adult is no longer able to ignore the presence of the dragon and recognizes it. And as soon as the dragon is recognized, it goes back to being a tiny little dragon. And of course, great kid story. If you've never had it, when you have the opportunity to buy little kid books, when you have your own kids or nieces and nephews or whatever, There's No Such Thing as Dragons ranks up there with Goodnight Moon and Sheep in a Jeep and Winnie the Pooh for great kids books. But like most great kids books, most fairy tales, most stories that we tell children, they are not really, they're kind of like dreams. They're not really about what they appear to be about. In this case, it's not about a dragon. It's about the fact that if you ignore a problem, it's only going to get bigger. And that's the problem with primitive withdrawal. That's the problem with getting drunk when you're miserable. You have a major problem and you can't deal with it, so you go out and you tie one on. And the problem is, the classic joke about what's the problem with getting drunk in response to a problem is that once you go out and you get drunk, and when you wake up the next morning, the problem is still there, and now you got a hangover, right? That's the problem with primitive withdrawal, is it doesn't actually change anything. The upside of it is the people who tend to like this tend to like it because they're actually frequently, not infrequently, they're they're fairly creative, imaginative people, and they're often reasonably sensitive people. They know what pain is about. Their pain is frightening enough to them that they avoid it, that they flee it, and withdraw from it. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, denial, refusal to accept reality. And by this, what we mean is, keep in mind, unconscious. So it's not, oh, look, something bad has happened, I'm going to pretend like that bad thing didn't happen. It's, I'm not allowing that bad thing to ever enter my consciousness. Or if it did enter my consciousness, I'm banishing, I'm repressing it and pretending like it isn't the case. And again, you see versions of this in most people. If you've ever gotten bad news and said no, or you see this sometimes. You see this in real life, but you also see it in movies. You know, somebody's told the death of somebody they love, and they just, you know, they shake their heads, and, you know, they hang their heads and shake their heads no. You see in that the shadow, I guess, the reflection of denial, the urge to use denial. Probably the best example I can give you of clinical example that I've seen of denial was that I was working, this is years ago, I was working in family practice. And I had a woman referred to me, mid-20s. She had been married for 5 or 6 years, perhaps. Long story short, she and her husband had a toddler, less than 2 years old, certainly, maybe just around 1. They were driving along in the car. Baby was in the back seat. In the baby seat, as it's supposed to be, they did everything right. In the middle seat, facing backward, the whole thing. And they were driving through an intersection with the green light. Somebody ran a red light, hit them, T-boned them, and killed the baby. And I mean, just awful, just tragic. And they went through the initial mourning process, the funeral, all of that. And within a couple of weeks of all of this, after all of the ritual was passed, and now the woman and her husband were faced with living with the tragedy of the loss of this baby. They wake up on a Saturday morning. The husband wakes up on a Saturday morning to the sound of his wife screaming. And he jumps out of bed, half awake, runs down the hall, sees her at the bedroom door, the nursery bedroom door. And she's screaming about somebody has taken their baby, the baby who had died. And you know, he thought maybe at first that she was sleepwalking or dreaming or something like that. And he's basically shaking her to, make sure she's awake, and she's awake. She's absolutely convinced that somebody has taken their child. And that's how they actually end up coming to me, because she had this reaction. It was so intense that they actually ended up sedating her. She woke up from it, was still in denial, was still convinced that somebody had taken the baby. And so they were referred to me for psychotherapy. Tragic. I mean, and it did resolve. We did help her past that. But a good demonstration of just how much of an impact intense trauma can have in some people. The other context in which you see denial, and we don't tend to think of it as this anymore, But the Freudian perspective on bipolar disorder, what we used to call manic depression, where you have cycles of mania, which is the opposite of depression. It's intense energy and euphoria and activity and no need for sleep, but just really, really intense, everything the opposite of depression. Oscillating with periods of correspondingly intense depression. And the Freudian theory is that the mania is a denial of depression. It is the opposite of the depression. It's not only am I not depressed, and this is actually, denial is the foundation of another defense mechanism we're going to talk about in a little bit called reaction formation. And in bipolar disorder, the mania is actually hypothetically a reaction formation. But at a very simple level, one way of thinking of mania is it is a denial of the depression, and that the depression emerges when the person exhausts themselves with the effort of the denial. And that, by the way, is, I wish I could claim that it was some brilliant clinical intervention on my part that resolved the denial that the young woman was experiencing, but in fact it was largely that it exhausted itself. It's a hard thing for a fundamentally sane person to sustain. And obviously you can see somebody who uses denial on an extended or regular basis is putting a tremendous amount of energy into it, to be able to not allow themselves to be aware of the nature of a undesirable reality. Omnipotent control, a remnant of early infantile magical thinking, the fantasy that one is in control of the external world and reality. So early on in infancy, this is normal. This is, at first it's not a defense, it's a mistake. They cry, that the infant is hungry and cries, and the mother comes in and feeds the infant, and the infant, as it's kind of figuring out the nature of the world, initially makes the presumption that it was responsible for satiation of its own hunger. The crying is what caused the hunger to be satiated, and of course, I guess in an indirect way, that's the case. But they have a mistaken attribution. They're assuming that it was the crying itself that led to the satiation of the hunger rather than the feeding. And early on in infancy, we make this mistake repeatedly, and that diminishes as our ignorance diminishes, and we start to figure out kind of the basics of the way the world works. But you see a residue of this in most of us, in essentially all of us. When you talk to cognitive psychologists, they'll talk about the locus of control, and a person either having an external or an internal locus of control. And somebody who has an external locus of control, that's problematic. And what that's referring to is the person's perception that they control virtually nothing in their lives, and they're just kind of moved around by fate, and they're essentially helpless. External locus of control. The opposite of that is the internal locus of control, which is the assumption that I am in control of my life and what happens to me. And of course, the truth of the matter is somewhere in between. You need a healthy sense of agency, of capacity to affect your life, but you also need the recognition that not everything is under your control. So that omnipotent control, that mistaken initial belief that you actually do control everything, eventually as reality sets in and you develop a more accurate interaction with reality, it recedes into hopefully a healthy locus of control. But we also see it in myths like you can do anything you set your mind to, which is demonstrably false. If you can say that, and we say that to children sometimes. You can do anything that you work hard for. You can do anything you set your mind to, but it's a lie. It's not true. Your range of ability probably exceeds your perception. You're probably capable of more than you realize you're capable of. But if you're telling somebody whose mother and father are both 5.5 feet tall and shorter, dad's 5'6" and mom is 5'4", that he, or even more so, she can be a center in the NBA. If you put your mind to it, well, obviously that's not true. And if you're kind of rolling your eyes going, well, yeah, of course. Well, if you're saying to a child, you can do anything you set your mind to, you perhaps are under the kind of the residual influence of this sense of control. And other place we see this is in people with sometimes in people with major depression. One of the things that you see in major depression is a disproportionate sense of guilt, a sense of guilt over things that frankly the person does not have realistic control and is not realistically responsible for. And when we talk about the structure of a depressive character, of a depressive personality later in the semester, we'll talk about kind of where that excessive sense of guilt, which is based on a misperception that they actually control more than they do, where that comes from. The other thing that you make note of with people who use this, who reflexively kind of rely on this defense, this assumption, this magical thinking, and people who are very superstitious. It would be an example of somebody who uses omnipotent control, sometimes problematically. Sometimes it actually causes suffering rather than alleviating suffering, at least temporarily. But somebody who is very invested in this and uses this frequently, does obviously, their personality is to some degree organized around a need for control as a mechanism for ensuring safety. The problem is that it's a conundrum, right? That if you perceive yourself as in control and then really bad things happen, well, now who's to blame? And so it can become very problematic. And that's one of the reasons why, well, one, it's not true, it's false. So that's part of the reason why it's a primary defense mechanism, because you're telling yourself something that is not true. And then two, even if you're able to pull off convincing yourself that you are in greater control than you actually are, that you are actually omnipotent to some degree, then the problem arises, how do you explain it to yourself when bad things, undesirable bad things happen? Right? But you're now in a corner. Okay, moving on to other primary or primitive defense mechanisms. Primitive idealization, residual of the attribution of omnipotence to the primary caregiver after the infant's reality testing disproves the infant's fantasies of omnipotence. Okay, so initially in infancy, the child makes the mistaken assumption that when events happen in the world, they happen because the infant chooses them to happen. Like I said before, that the child is hungry, cries, is fed, and makes the initial assumption that satiation occurred because the infant wanted it to. And of course, what happens with experience is the child begins to recognize that this is not the case. And the next step, so to speak, in that process is the early precursors of the infant's perception of mother are developing. So it cries, mommy shows up, picks up the baby, feeds the baby, and in doing that, the baby, in the mother doing that, the baby has a really strong positive response. That this being, which it doesn't, of course, initially recognize as mother, because it's got to learn that conceptualization. It's got to kind of piece it together over repeated experiences in the first year of life. So initially, the object relations people talk about that the infant's initial response is to the good breast or to the bad breast, and what they're alluding to there is what they call part objects, and this is essentially that the infant is attributing its pleasure, its relief, to that object, to that part of mom, because it doesn't have the concept yet of an actual person. And all of the sense of power that the infant held, mistakenly assumed it had, it now perceives in that part object, and eventually in the mother herself, as the child kind of pieces things together. And so when mom comes to the rescue, or whoever the caregiver is, comes to the rescue and saves the infant from his or her hunger, the mother is adored. Now, interestingly, the converse of that also is happening, in that when the baby is frustrated, as the concept of mother begins to emerge, first as part objects, like the object relations people that we'll talk about a little bit later in the semester alluded to when they talked about good breast, bad breast. Bad breast would be mommy not coming in, and the infant would feel a tremendous anger. Of course, the anger is just general frustration, and then as the infant becomes aware of objects, including part objects that will eventually become filled out into people, that anger is directed toward that part object, which is perceived as essentially evil, all bad. And then when fed, the baby doesn't know that it's the same person. The baby doesn't recognize that the mother who isn't in the room yet, I don't know, perhaps they're not breastfeeding, perhaps they're warming up formula. And so the baby is suffering in its hunger for a little bit while the formula is prepared. And then the mother arrives with the formula, or if the mother's breastfeeding, something delays her. Well, the delayed mother is not initially recognized by the infant as the same person as the mother who is feeding the infant, because at first it's not even recognized as a person, right? It's just part object. But once personhood is recognized, the infant doesn't initially make the recognition that mommy when he feels good, or mommy when she feels good, is the same mommy as when you're mad or hungry or scared or cold or whatever. Because the infant is imbuing the world around it with whatever emotions it experiences, right? So it mistakenly assumes if I'm mad, everything is bad. If I'm content, everything is good, right? So that's that's the developmental source of this primitive idealization, and we see residue of this throughout in the devaluation. We see residue of this throughout childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. You see it a lot in adolescence. The classic example in adolescence would be the turmoil that takes place as the adolescent is making further and further and further separation from mom or dad. And as they come to see that mom, dad are imperfect, just people, there not infrequently is a lot of anger profound devaluation as that idealization, that primitive, unrealistic idealization is lost. They flip to the corresponding devaluation. Well, if you're not as good as I thought you were, if you're not as perfect as I thought you were, you must be reprehensible. You must be just horrible. So you see this in adolescence. You see this throughout culture. The Freudians and the psychoanalytic people would argue they make the argument that the tendency among humans to believe in an omnipotent, so all-powerful, omniscient, all-knowing supreme being, or a god or gods, is the result of, or is the residue, let's say, of this primitive idealization and the belief in a being of pure evil, in Satan or the devil or Mephistopheles or whatever, is a residue of that early infantile devaluation. And then later on in the semester, toward the end of the semester, we're going to talk about borderline personality and narcissism, both of which are characterized by fluctuating between idealizing people and devaluing people, idealizing the self and devaluing the self. And of course, anybody who's immersed in this is struggling with, is not mature, is struggling with immaturity, right? When you see a teenager behaving this way, and they do, even in normal adolescence, you see teenagers behaving like this, and the impression that you get when that happens is that the teenager is being remarkably immature, and that's exactly the case. It's actually very primitive. Related to this fluctuation between idealization and devaluation is the concept of splitting. And this is essentially, we're kind of moving forward when we're talking about these defense mechanisms, we're moving forward through development. And splitting is kind of the next step in the process when the infant is beginning to get the idea that mom is a whole, is an integrated whole. There's no part objects anymore. And there's a period, hypothetically, theoretically, there's a period in there where the infant is kind of on the cusp of recognizing that good mommy and bad mommy are the same person. But to get there, they have to pass through this period where they manage their ambivalence. Ambivalence, I think I may have talked to you about this before. Ambivalence is the term meaning that you simultaneously hold two opposing emotions, love and hate, as an example. There can be other ones too, but that's the common one we talk about, that you have a positive and a negative emotion simultaneously toward one person. And that's a very difficult thing for anybody to tolerate. For an infant, that initial experience of it is profoundly disturbing, partly because the person toward whom the infant is having ambivalence, and the reason that the infant is having ambivalence is related to the infant's absolute dependence on that person who is perceived by the infant as being all-powerful. So when the all-powerful mother figure does not feed the infant is left to puzzle why. If the mother is all-powerful, if the caregiver, whomever, is omnipotent and causing, in the baby's eyes, causing the infant's suffering, then that person must be bad. And of course, we're speaking kind of in a somewhat logical manner, and we're using language, but we're using this to describe something that is pre-verbal, right? These aren't words going through the infant's head. It's just trying to make sense of reality. As reality becomes more and more and more organized, and personhood, recognition of individual personhood begins to develop, and that kind of thing. So splitting is essentially the infant, as it's beginning to recognize the person of mother, telling themselves, no. When I'm suffering and unhappy and in pain, the person who's causing that is is bad mommy, and this is good mommy when mommy is feeding me and whatever. So they're splitting the individual into two separate persons in their perception. Um, uh, and if this feels very much like primitive idealization and primitive devaluation, it is very much like it. It's what kind of develops out of that. It's just a little bit more integrated. This is more when the person is recognizing the person as a whole, and they recognize it, but then they can't tolerate that, so they tell themselves, no, this is actually two different people. The person who is my mother when I'm suffering is a bad mommy, and the person who's my mother when I'm feeling good is good mommy. And we do this. You see residue of this in adulthood. The tendency to idealize and almost worship celebrities until they trip and fall and show themselves to be unworthy of that admiration, and then they are rejected. They must not have been good at all. They must be horrible. This is how the characters are often depicted. You see this. You see this in Harry Potter. Harry Potter and Voldemort are opposite sides of a coin, right? You see this over and over and over in literature and in movies and so on and so forth, where the good guy and the bad guy are opposing opposites. And in some movies, they are actually literally the same person, right? You do have those movies where there is a split. There was a movie, I guess it was a horror movie, not too long ago, and the main character had multiple personalities. So they were presenting this idea, which is most generally in books and movies presented metaphorically. They were presenting it very literally, and splitting like primitive idealization and devaluation is characteristic of borderline personality. And again, we'll talk about that later in the semester. Projection, also a primary defense mechanism, primary primitive defense mechanism, is what is inside is misunderstood as coming from the outside. So this is the source of the isms. The source of racism, for example. Racism is the projection of hated aspects of the self, the way you perceive yourself, the bad parts of you, that you convince yourself, I'm not like this. This person who looks or in some way is very much unlike me, that's who has those attributes. I'm not dirty, lazy, ignorant, cruel, in poor control of my emotions or urges. It's this person who looks unlike me. And I talked earlier in this lecture or the previous one about homophobia. And homophobia, the defense mechanism, or one of the defense mechanisms in play with homophobia, is projection. I'm not gay, you're gay, and I hate that in you. And now that obviously that works better for the homophobic person if the person that they're hating is actually homosexual, because then now it's connected in some way to reality. Of course, the denial of the reality that's being denied are their own urges, which, keep in mind, again, Freud made the argument that people are inherently bisexual. He was arguing that all human beings have the capacity and probably the actual experience, although probably unconsciously, of both homosexual and heterosexual responses. And the reality is, the modern research, the data supports that. The data supports that there is essentially no such thing as a human being who is 100% heterosexual or 100% homosexual. Most of us fall on a continuum. The vast majority, nearly all of us, fall on a continuum in between. So Freud was on to something. So anyway, projection. The basis for racism, the basis for homophobia, the basis for many hatreds is not me, you. but in fact, the thing that you're hating in that person is something you can't stand about yourself. Um, so you see the excessive use of projection, particularly in people who are paranoid. Paranoia is, I don't have these negative or threatening or dangerous, unpleasant urges. You have them, and as such, you're a threat to me. I'm not violent. You're violent, and I got to do what I can to protect myself. And the irony in paranoia is they'll perceive somebody as malicious. And we're not talking about somebody who's a raving lunatic, paranoid, schizophrenic sort of a thing, like what you would picture in a movie. We're talking about people who are hateful, and they look at others and they see their hatefulness. They don't recognize it in themselves, and instead they see it in somebody else, and that gives them permission to treat that person with some degree of hostility. And of course, what happens if you treat somebody with hostility? Well, they're likely to react back with hostility, which proves to the paranoid person, I was right. See, they're hostile. And then it ratchets up, right? And they can actually end up becoming aggressive, but feel like the aggrieved party. They're completely innocent. I didn't do it. It's this person who was mean to me. Again, projection. Projection can be really problematic and is the source of a lot of the problems that arise from hatred between individuals and groups. But then the flip side of that coin is that projection is kind of like the building block for empathy. I see in somebody else what I see in me. So for the person who develops insight, initially when you're young, you may succumb to the urge to project, to see in others the thing you can't tolerate in yourself. But as you mature and you begin to recognize your own faults and your own shortcomings and your own shameful urges and these kinds of things, that capacity to make the connection between what is in you and what is in me, what comprises you and comprises me. Terence, the ancient Roman philosopher, Roman philosopher said, "Nothing human. I am human. Nothing human is alien to me." Essentially making the point that with enough care and with enough thought, we're each imperfect enough. We're each fallen, in religious language, fallen enough that if we're honest with ourselves, we can see in ourselves everything that we dislike, loathe in others. And we recognize in ourselves their suffering, their happiness, etc., etc. So projection on the positive side, basis for empathy. On the negative side, the reflexive thing that many of us use for disavowing and attributing to somebody else things we don't like about ourselves. The other side of that coin is primitive identification, which we also call introjection. So projection is misunderstanding and perceiving something that is inside as coming from the outside. Primitive identification is the opposite. It's perceiving what is outside as instead coming from the inside. What is outside is misunderstood as coming from the inside. Excuse me. This is a normal stage in development, and if you think back to what we were talking about before, where the infant is hungry, is in distress, and then is satiated, you can see the source of primary identification, because it starts out as the belief that I am the one that satisfied my hunger, as an example. And then, of course, built on top of that is the gradual recognition that, okay, well, it wasn't me, it was this part object, the good breast that saved me. And then it wasn't the part object, it was good mommy that saved me. Um, and then as the infant and eventually the toddler begins to relate to more and more and more realistic objects, more and more realistic understanding of the people with whom and recognition of the people with whom the infant and toddler are interacting, there is this underlying residual kind of like you have to kind of come to terms with the fact that just because mommy responds to a need that I have doesn't mean that my need is in her, or that her being tuned into me doesn't mean that we are inherently the same person. And initially that's misunderstood, that when the mother is what is the word? Well aligned? That's not the right word. When the mother is tuned in to what the baby needs, that the infant can misperceive that that her responsiveness is actually coming from within me, that we are connected, that I am part of her. And then so that of course that begins to dissipate as unrealistic as the infant kind of starts to figure things out. But under stress, we often revert. The infant. You see this, the second bullet point there about dangerous situations. You see this in the Stockholm syndrome, where somebody is kidnapped, and if treated at all nicely by their captor, by their kidnapper, they identify with their kidnapper and align themselves with the kidnapper and even fall in love. In fact, one of the things that when we talk about falling in love, we talk about, merging, like especially romantic love, we talk about it as if we're merging, we're identified with this person, we're connected. We talk about the Greek myth of what was it, the androgyne, I think was what it was called. The mythical pre-human beings that were male and female, and that they're separated at some point in history, and that when you find somebody and fall in love, you find your other half. You get this kind of romantic talk, and that the Freudians would say, well, that romantic talk is residual of this primitive identification. So it can be seen in these romantic relationships. It can be seen in situations where like the Stockholm syndrome. It can be seen in situations where you feel helpless and you find yourself enamored of, a little boy who during the phallic stage and even a little bit after that, as first dealing with his own inadequacy and his need for connectedness to mommy and daddy, each in a different way, and then later recognizing how inadequate he is relative to an adult male, may find himself identifying with comic book heroes. The little kids love Superman because Superman is everything that they are not. So they become they will eventually identify that. That tends to be a little more mature form of identification rather than the primitive identification where there is actual confusion, right? That identification that I'm describing with the comic books is a little more mature, and we'll come back to that in just a minute. The other point here that I want to make sure I hit was this is also the source, theoretically, this is the source of that profound sense of emptiness and almost like a physical loss. People will talk when they lose a parent or somebody who they're profoundly loved, that they will talk almost as if there is a part of me that is gone now. And when we talk in terms of primitive introjection, what we're talking about is that you in a fairly, I won't say concrete way, but or literal, but you do have the infant having the sense of incorporating the part. And if you think about it, there is a realistic component to this, because the infant is quite literally incorporating mommy, especially if the infant is breastfed, right? So there are some kind of philosophical bases for thinking about this. We also have this concept that is a little more complicated. You see this talked about in psychotherapy quite a bit, and it is characteristic of people who are fairly disturbed. Borderline personality disorder tends to use projective identification, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a combination of projection and identification. And this is essentially, as the first bullet point there indicates, the person projects internal representations and unconsciously maneuvers the person on whom they're projected to behave in a manner similar to the original. So you have somebody who's a fairly disturbed individual because of trauma experienced in their youth, in their toddlerhood or infancy, and they are mistreated, perhaps even abused by a caregiver figure with whom they have some degree of identification. So they've internalized this hostile, bad object, part object or whole object. This is now part of who they are, right? This thing that mistreated them, this character who mistreated them in their early childhood. And they go around anticipating this from everywhere else. They project it. They project this expectation on everything else. And in doing so, they behave toward the rest of the world as if the rest of the world is sufficiently is hostile to them in a way similar to that early experience. And of course, as I said before, when we were talking about paranoia, you treat other people that way, and they're going to tend to behave that way. So what they end up doing is they end up recreating this early experience that they had over and over and over again, and it just keeps reinforcing it. And part of the goal of psychotherapy is, when you get projective identification, is to recognize it and help the person have a different experience. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we talk about borderline personality. And then the last of the defenses that we'll talk about as primary or primitive, because really dissociation, detachment from and isolation of conscious experience, is kind of the no man's land. It's kind of the gray area between primitive defenses, inefficient, energy consuming, not reality based, and secondary or more mature defenses that are a little more effective and reality based. And the reason why we talk about dissociation as kind of the no man's land is it's a fairly what we sometimes talk about it as a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances. If you are exposed to a profoundly traumatizing experience, it's not an unreasonable reaction to that experience to, in the moment, to manage it. You can't escape it. You can't do anything to prevent it. To manage it by simply denying to yourself, and that's the foundation of this, that it is happening to you. You detach yourself from the reality, and you contain it within this moment. And dissociation is the source. If you have somebody who is repeatedly, serially traumatized by repeated, especially painful sexual abuse, especially when it comes from somebody who's trusted, and it happens over and over and over and over again, and is frightening and or painful. The person cannot escape it, and so what they do is they essentially kind of run and hide within themselves, and they tell themselves, this is not happening to me. And if it happens enough, what happens is that they get into this pattern of that the abuse is happening to this particular person that is not them, or a person that is part of them. And they dissociate that from the rest of them. They disassociate that from the rest of them. And if that goes on long enough and they get practiced enough at it, and they begin to generalize that, and when other things happen that are unpleasant, they dissociate that, and they treat that as if that's not happening to me. Then you can get this pattern, which can be fine-tuned and turned into something where you really do have what we used to call multiple personalities that are actually really disconnected from one another, and the person sometimes is even aware that they're doing it. They might not even have a memory of the trauma, except for when they're exposed to circumstances that are similar to that trauma. So the reason why we talk about it as the no man's land, or the gray area between primitive and secondary defenses, is because it is, like I said before, somebody once said that it's a normal response to an abnormal, intolerable situation. So from here on, we're going to talk about secondary defense mechanisms. Okay, so we'll talk from here on out about secondary, or more efficient defense mechanisms. Efficient economically, which is the Freudian term for the use of psychic energy, the amount of effort that it takes psychologically to hold these defenses in place. They're also more effective, more sophisticated, in the sense that they don't tend to cause the same kinds of interpersonal or social problems that things like projection and primitive denial and these kinds of things will tend to cause. So when you see when you have an individual, say you're doing psychotherapy, and you have somebody and you're perceiving consistently, you're perceiving primitive or primary defense mechanisms, it's a cue that this person is in a psychological personality sense fairly disorganized, immature, not like in a pejorative sense, but immature in the sense that they're grappling with things that are characteristic of childhood rather than adulthood. They haven't mastered things that you would expect that they would have mastered, and that they're going to be frequently anxious, angry, distressed, overwhelmed, that sort of thing. Conversely, if you have somebody and you consistently recognize secondary defense mechanisms, and if you find that they relatively easily can come to terms consciously with these defense mechanisms. In other words, when you present them with evidence that they're defending against something, they're relatively capable of recognizing that and acknowledging it. Then that's an indication that you're dealing with somebody who's more intact, more mature, ego function is stronger, etc. So we'll talk here for the rest of this lecture about the secondary defense mechanisms. I'm going to go a little more quickly on these because they're not as foreign to you. They're things that you'll probably recognize, although I'm sure you recognize some of the primitive ones also in yourself and the people around you. You'll recognize that the secondary ones, I think, probably much more readily and much more frequently. The secondary defense mechanism. The first one we'll talk about is displacement. Displacement is basically taking out on a safer target something that you feel toward a person who is, for whatever reason, you can't discharge that feeling toward. So this can be, the example I always use is, a guy gets yelled at by his boss and he goes home and he walks to the front door, and his kids are like, "Daddy!" And they run up to him and they hug him, and he snaps at him and says, "Leave me alone." That would be displacement. That he felt picked on or belittled or aggressed upon it by his boss, had an angry reaction that he couldn't express because he could lose his job. So he holds on to it, he contains it, and he's going home. He's not consciously thinking, "Hey, I'm going to take this out on the kids." But in reality, that's exactly what's happening. He's discharging that energy, that hostility that he should be directing, or that is actually being felt towards his boss, and it is getting directed toward a safer target, in this case the kids, until mom finds out, and then you get in trouble, and that sort of thing. But it's not just anger. You could have you could be in a long-term relationship with somebody, and the classic one: long-term relationship with somebody, committed relationship. You guys go to a movie, you go to a romantic comedy, and very, very good-looking leading man and leading woman in the movie, the actor and actress, and you spend an hour and a half identified with the same-sex character. The guy's identified with the male and thinking, "Oh, what would it be like to be with that woman?" And the woman's identified with the female character and thinking, "Oh, what it would be like to be with that handsome actor." And you go home and you have really, really good nookie. You've developed these urges as a result of watching the movie, perhaps having feelings toward the characters depicted. That obviously is not an option, and even if it were an option, perhaps you're committed enough to the relationship that instead that energy gets displaced onto your partner. And the reality is that probably isn't a particularly difficult thing to do, because presumably you are also attracted to that partner. So displacement is easier when it's reality-based, to discharge the tension, the sexual tension that arises from watching this movie onto a sexual partner, reality-based. Discharging anger felt at the boss toward the kids when they're being annoying, reality-based. It may not be fair, but it's reality-based. And it alleviates the psyche of having to contain that energy. You got to discharge it. Now, there may be other costs to it. Like I said, kind of kiddingly before, you come home and yell at the kids for nothing, and you're probably going to be in trouble with your spouse. But at least it discharged that tension. So that requires less energy than just holding on to it or denying it or whatever. Regression. Regression you can think of as kind of a temporary break, a retreat to a lower level of development, generally because of anxiety. Almost everybody does this. In fact, I would say everybody does this. Comfort eating would be a regression, an oral level regression. One of the things that, if you were all in the classroom, I would say, "All right, everybody close your eyes." And, well, actually, it doesn't really work so much when you close your eyes, although it is interesting for me. But I would say, "Okay, everybody, if you're comfortable admitting it, if you have a stuffed animal from home that you brought with you to college, raise your hand." And it's 3/4 of the class every time, mostly female, but occasionally you get males who will acknowledge it too. Probably more males than are willing to admit it have some what we call transitional object, stuffed animal or something like that they bring with them too. They're a little more reluctant for cultural reasons to admit it. Most of the girls will acknowledge it. And it's there to allow for the possibility of regression. If you've ever had a really horrible, horrible day and you go and you lay down and you curl up into a little ball, into the fetal position, you are regressing. If you stay there, you have a serious problem. If you're there temporarily, it's a way of managing overwhelming anxiety. I'm retreating from it. It's kind of like fantasy, what we were talking about earlier, but not exactly primitive withdrawal fantasy. Not exactly the same thing. It's just a temporary return to a lower level of development that is more comfortable for you. You've mastered it. You feel okay in it. You go, you rest for a little bit, and then you get on with your life. Fixation. Fixation is less temporary. The reason why we're including it, so fixation is pause in psychological development when the person remains preoccupied with developmental tasks and cannot move on. An example of this is, you find yourself in young adulthood consistently getting yourself involved in situations where, in love triangles, where there's jealousy and envy and you wrestle with whether the person likes you or doesn't like you, and whether they like somebody else more, and that kind of stuff. And Freud would look at that and go, well, you know what? You're Oedipally fixated. You're still getting yourself involved unconsciously. You don't realize you're doing it, but you're getting yourself involved in relationships, trying to resolve this conflict that you had, this complex that you experienced when you were 3, 4, 5 years old. Similarly, you're somebody and you have a lot of tension in your relationship with one or both of your parents. You don't get along with your dad, and so you repeatedly find yourself bucking authority. You repeatedly find yourself, you meet somebody who's an authority figure, and your initial reaction to that authority figure is a kind of a hostility, and you end up getting involved in the same general kinds of tension and disagreement with that authority figure that you did with dad. Now, keep in mind, we're not necessarily in these real life situations. We're often talking about multiple kind of overlapping defense mechanisms. In that case, it would be partially displacement, right? Because these things that we're wrestling with dad are getting displaced onto a different authority figure. There is fixation involved because you haven't moved past that stage. Perhaps in that situation, there's probably some projection. The hostility that you feel toward dad, you perceive in that authority figure, probably because you're used to perceiving it in dad, because you guys were jerks to each other. And so you perceive it in that authority figure. You act as if he is hostile towards you, which of course tends to elicit hostility from him. So you can see how these things work. Other thing I want to make sure I mention about fixation before I move on is that it is one of the factors involved in separation anxiety. In situations where you get a child, and we're talking about beyond just making strange in the later half of the first year of life, which is a developmentally normal progression. We're talking about later, a kid is a kindergartner and refuses to go to kindergarten classes, freaks out when you try to drop them off. I don't think that this was me that wrote this. It's been long enough that I don't remember it, but I don't remember if I did steal it from somebody. I don't remember who I took it from. That it is fear, not love, that binds some children to the mother's apron strings. If you have a child who is refusing separation, who's refusing to immerse themselves in normal childhood and instead just clings to mommy or daddy or whoever the primary caregiver is, it's not because they're madly loving that parent, it's because they're afraid. And interestingly, sometimes the fear is actually hostility. That the child lives in a home where angry feelings or negative feelings in general can't be expressed. They have a normal life. You have negative feelings towards your family. But if you're in a situation where you're a little kid and you're not allowed to deal with that, not allowed to acknowledge it, not allowed to experience it, then what you're often left with is nowhere for those feelings to go. And in the normal course of that sort of a thing, one of the things that the little kids tend to experience is that omnipotent control, right? That sense that my bad feeling toward mommy or daddy or whatever can make something bad happen to them. I don't want to separate from them because I'm afraid that because I'm mad at them, something bad is going to happen to them. So yeah, fixation. Reaction formation. Reaction formation is, you heard me reference this earlier when we were talking about denial as part of bipolar disorder, that it had a role in mania being a denial of depression. Well, in reality, to be a little more specific about it, a little more accurate about it, Mania would be a reaction formation. So something that is frightening to you, you experience not as the frightening urge or the frightening feeling or the frightening instinct, but instead as its opposite. Not only do I not hate you, I love you. Not only am I not depressed, I'm deliriously happy and energetic, manic. The classic example of this is like 90% of the romantic movies ever made, right? The romantic comedies, where the leads, the male and the female in the romantic comedy, they have their meeting, and how many of them do they dislike each other when they first meet? And they can't stand each other. Well, when you take a step back and you look at the structure of the movie, almost inevitably it is that they have each been through painful experiences previously, and they're terrified of being hurt again. Or perhaps not so much that as they meet somebody and they're overwhelmed with the need for that person and it frightens them. So they deny that need by reaction formation. Not only do I not attracted to you, I can't stand you, get away from me. And of course, that part of why that's so useful for a romantic comedy is it's often everybody else can see except for them, except for the two people that are involved. And their behavior takes on somewhat of a compulsive quality, they can't acknowledge anything positive about the other person. One of the best examples of this in a movie that I've seen, great movie, Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, Keanu Reeves, Denzel Washington, Michael Keaton. Oh gosh, there's like 2 or 3 other people that everybody knows, like a huge cast of famous people were in Much Ado About Nothing, the Shakespearean comedy. And Kenneth Branagh directed it. He's done a lot of the Shakespeare stuff, and it's almost always good. If you don't know the names that I'm listing, yes, you do. You just haven't put a name and a face together. If you go look at this, you'll recognize all sorts of people in it. And Much Ado About Nothing is these 2 main characters played by Kenneth Branagh and Emma Thompson, both of whom were in the Harry Potter movies, in case you're trying to figure out where you know them. They are clearly well suited for one another and consciously repulsed by one another because they both desperately would like to be together. And it's a hilarious depiction of this. One which has been imitated over and over and over and over and over again. I mean, Shakespeare, it's been imitated repeatedly by other romantic comedies. The other classic example of a reaction formation is macho men. The reality is the guy who's macho, the guy who is hyper masculine, the guy who has no feminine softness, no gentleness, no capacity for tenderness, and he's all big belt buckles, monster truck tires, guns, facial hair, and badassness. It's an act. I mean, every male and female has some capacity for masculinity, some more, some less. And every male has some capacity for femininity, some more, some less. And when we talk about Jung, we'll talk about this in more detail. But the macho man is the man who cannot tolerate that in himself, who can't allow the possibility that there might be a feminine aspect to who he is. There might be some tenderness, there might be some softness, there might be some vulnerability, because it frightens him. And so he becomes an exaggeration. Not only am I not female, I'm hyper masculine, right? Reaction formation. Okay. Intellectualization. Pretty straightforward concept. Presumably everybody in the class uses this. It's actually a version of isolation. Isolation would be a defense in which one recognizes that he or she has a feeling, but is not actually feeling it. So something bad happens, and you have a friend, and you say, well, how are you doing? And they say, well, I'm pretty sad. But as you talk to them and as you interact with them, you don't see any evidence they're actually experiencing the emotion, but they will acknowledge that it's there. So that's isolation. Intellectualization is so isolation requires some energy, because while you're acknowledging it's there, so it's not denial. You're not allowing the experience of the emotion. So you're holding it at bay with force of will, essentially. And of course, you're not even allowing yourself to be aware that you're holding it at bay. Somebody will say, well, you got to let yourself feel it. And the person who's isolating will often say, well, I am feeling it. And they'll point as evidence of that they can acknowledge that they're sad, even though they're not demonstrating it. So lost my train of thought. Intellectualization is a more sophisticated form. It's a little more effective. And what this is yes, I'm sad. You'll do this someday, maybe, years from now. So, something will happen, and you'll be in grief, and somebody says, you seem so grief-stricken. Oh, yeah, I definitely am, and when you realize that grief is actually has all of the same trappings of depression, but depression is a sad reaction or a grief reaction when you've lost nothing, and grief, of course, is a reality-based reaction, blah, 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 all of which may be accurate. But you immerse yourself in understanding and analyzing the feelings rather than actually experiencing them. Now, the upside of this is it demonstrates that the person is fairly intact, that they can stay calm enough, and they're in enough control that they can they can intellectualize about things, but in sufficient ego strength to actually tolerate the burden of the emotion. Now, this isn't necessarily a terrible thing. Sometimes it's a temporary thing, that you work to understand the emotion as a way of managing it until you're in such a circumstance where you can allow yourself to actually experience it. So intellectualization, and a similar defense mechanism, rationalization. So intellectualization is you're doing a lot of analyzing of it. You're working all around it. You're looking at it from different perspectives, and you understand this thing, whatever it is. Rationalization is explaining away. So it would be you have aggressive impulses that you feel toward the professor for going on and on way too long in his lecture, and you have fantasies of taking a hammer to it. And the intellectualization of that might be, you considering the reality of the feeling. Yep, I can acknowledge it's there. I'm not going to allow myself to actually feel it, but I can acknowledge it's there. I know that it's probably residual of primitive fantasies of omnipotent control and the urge to destroy that's sometimes expressed in childhood by the clenching shut of eyes as if out of sight, out of mind, blah, blah, before object permanence and all that kind of stuff. Intellectualization. Rationalization would be, well, you know what? It is completely understandable that I want to bash his head in with a hammer because he will not shut the hell up. He keeps going on and on and on and on. Anybody in this situation would feel this way. It's a normal part of human experience, and I'll tell you how, blah, 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 blah. So you're using intellectualization, but you're using it not just to understand the emotion, but essentially to say it's okay, or to say it's not that big of a deal. It's using the language and the logic of the ego to defang, to make non-threatening some urge or instinct that one has. Isolation, I already spoke to this. The slides appear to be out of order a little bit. Can be problematic. But it also can be a mechanism for being able to continue to function in a circumstance that would otherwise be overwhelming. And a good example of that is a surgeon or a general. the general who is aware of the grief caused by his decisions and feels even the grief caused by his decisions, but isolates that. Can acknowledge, yep, it's there, but is not going to allow himself to feel it. There's time for that later. Yeah. Oh, and then if you're a Star Trek fan, Mr. Spock is the perfect example of this, because he wants to claim that he does not have feelings, and yet he observes himself having the feeling. Yeah, anyway, Star Trek nerd. Another way of talking about isolation is psychic numbing, psychological numbing. It's there, but I don't feel it. Similar to isolation is compartmentalization. So this is that you're kind of like you're isolating different feelings from one another. So it allows you to tolerate simultaneous but conflicting feelings, simultaneous but conflicting beliefs, etc. And an example of this would be simultaneously believing in the golden rule, do unto others, and look out for number one. Do whatever you got to do to get by. Right? We see this all of the time. It's very, very common. The classic example of this is the public religious figure. In fact, we just had this happen. The public religious figure, the guy who was the president of Liberty University, is it Falwell? Who just came crashing down because he was involved in all sorts of sexual hijinks, sexual misbehavior that his religious background prohibits. And he presumably in those situations, the individual often can separate out that misbehavior, compartmentalize it, and still see themselves as a good person. And as I'm saying this, I'm thinking, well, that isn't necessarily untrue. You don't become a terrible person. Martin Luther King doesn't become a terrible person because he had affairs, right? That compartmentalization allowed him to still do some great things, even with his imperfection. But it's a way of allowing us to tolerate. And this, if you think about it, this is kind of residual. This is kind of the mature version of idealization and devaluation. It's kind of like the person saying, I can't be a person who has both of these components to who I am. So I have to separate them out and pretend as if each of them, almost as if they don't exist with one another, right? And you primarily do that just by just it's there, but you don't think about it. When I'm involved in doing X, I know Y is there, but I'm not going to allow myself to deal with it. When I'm doing Y, I'm not going to allow myself to think about X being there. This is one of the ways that this is kind of related to dissociation. One of the ways that people cope with trauma, they compartmentalize it. They package it and they put it over here. And if this sounds like isolation, there's a similar component to it. Isolation is more about feeling, about protecting yourself from the intensity of a feeling. Compartmentalization is more about coping with incongruence in your self-image, right? Allowing you to maintain a certain picture of yourself or a picture of somebody else. Despite some incompatible trait or quality or behavior or thought. Moralization. Okay, so we talked about intellectualization, the analyzing of some fault, some problematic emotion, instinct, urge, whatever. And then we talked about rationalization, which is explaining away those things. Saying, well, it's not that big of a deal because it's understandable because. Moralization is taking this one step further, and it's saying not only am I analyzing it, not only am I explaining it away, I'm going one more step beyond that, and I'm explaining how it's not only okay, it's actually a good thing, right? This is the person who who loses his temper with a bully and beats the snot out of him and then walks away and says, well, it's probably for the best, because if I didn't do it, somebody else was going to do it. He really could have gotten hurt. It's probably good that he learned his lesson, and he'll be, maybe that'll help him change. Your loss of control. Now, bear in mind, if you're thinking to yourself, well, that's probably true. Maybe it was good that the bully got beat up. Maybe. That's the nature of secondary defense mechanisms, is they tend to be reality based. And what rationalization in that situation would allow you to do, say you're a person with strong religious beliefs about, or just general moral beliefs about violence, and the bully picks one time too many, you beat the snot out of him, and you manage the guilt by saying, well, I actually did something good for him. It's for his good. It's not just because I lost control of my aggression. So it's twisting the whole thing around, and you see this very frequently in people who have strong obsessive compulsive traits. They tend to manage the behaviors that they're unable to resist acting out by justifying them, by moralizing about them, and saying, not only is this okay that I'm doing this, it's actually a good thing that I'm doing this. Moralization. So it's on that same continuum with intellectualization, rationalization, moralization. Intellectualization, analyzing; rationalization, explaining away; moralization, justifying. A couple more. Undoing. Undoing is an apology. You do something terrible to somebody, and you say, "Oh, I am so sorry," and the person says, "Oh, it's okay." The fact of your penitence, the fact of your apology, undoes. In fact, we think about it like that, right? Because we think, oh, if you accept my apology, then we're good, as if it erased the offense. Similarly, the step on a crack, break your mother's back. Step on a crack, break your mother's back, which most people at some point in childhood do this. And you get walking along the sidewalk. Either you do it as a game with your friends, or you do it as a game, and the thought appears in your mind: step on a crack, break your mother's back. So you get really careful. I don't want to step on any cracks. Well, the source of this, that in and of itself, is actually something of a reaction formation, because actually what's happening is you're feeling normal, maybe even healthy, anger, hostility, whatever, toward mom or dad or whatever, in this case, towards mom, and you manage it by saying, not only do I not want to be angry or hostile toward mom, I want to protect her by avoiding stepping on cracks. Well, the thought of stepping on a crack and breaking your mother's back came from somewhere. And it came from normal, natural conflict in relationships. And you tend to see this in childhood as the child is coming to terms with their capacity to have negative feelings toward mom or dad or whomever, right? And so the ritualized act of avoiding the cracks is a way of undoing, of pretending as if I don't feel. It is, if you're thinking, well, it sounds a lot like reaction formation. Well, it kind of is. Undoing and reaction formation are similar dynamics. We're just describing slightly different applications. You see this, as I was saying before, about obsessive compulsive characters. You see obsessive compulsive characters using undoing quite a bit. The classic hand washing, which you can see in all sorts of people with obsessive and compulsive traits, but you see especially in young adolescent males, 12, 13, 14 years old, at the beginning of the intensity of the adolescent sexual experience, with all of the urges. And you see this with boys that are raised in religious or highly moralized backgrounds, they begin to have sexual urges, particularly around self-stimulation. They use their hands, they touch themselves, and then they find themselves, and they don't even allow themselves to make the connection. So if you ask them this, they won't see that there's a relationship between their compulsive, their sense that their hands are dirty, they got to wash their hands repeatedly, and what they've been doing with their hands. They don't recognize the connection, but they do get a sense of relief temporarily from washing their hands. Right? They're trying to wash away their sin. So undoing, unconscious effort to counterbalance some emotion with an attitude or a behavior that erases it. And again, not dissimilar to reaction formation. Turning against the self is redirecting a negative impulse or feeling from its object toward the self. You see this in depressive people quite frequently. That they'll have a fairly normal, understandable angry reaction or hostile reaction or some negative reaction towards somebody, and their way of responding to that is, oh, I'm a terrible person. I'm a terrible person for having this response. And they really beat themselves up figuratively, in some cases even literally. They really are hard on themselves. And it is a way of making of penance, right? It's a way of making up for having that negative feeling. It also, when we get talking about depressive character, we'll talk about this in some detail because it's one of the core things that you see with somebody with strong depressive character. So end of the semester, when we talk about depressive personality, we'll talk about how turning against the self is kind of integral to that. Identification. This is what we're talking about here is the mature version, the secondary level version of introjection or primitive identification. So primitive identification is where you almost have a sense of merging with the person. The boundaries between you and the other person with whom you're primitively identified or you introjected become unclear, become fuzzy. And sometimes you see this in psychotic people, that they'll have a sense of being one with somebody. You also see this in some situations where there's really, really intense emotional circumstances around romantic love or something, and you get that primitive merging of primitive identification with the loved person. Identification in the secondary defensive sense is more pragmatic. It's more perceiving somebody as admirable or desirable or more capable of you, and then emulating them, trying to pattern yourself after that person. So we'll break this down just real quick, and we'll talk about the three basic types. We've already talked about one of them, the three basic types of identification. The type that we've already talked about is that primary or primitive identification, introjection, that you see in infancy and early toddlerhood, and it arises from the poor boundaries, the amorphous boundaries that are characteristic of infancy, when they're still learning kind of where the self ends and the rest of the world begins, and where they're learning to distinguish individuals and perceive people rather than part objects and that sort of thing. It's that early developmental experience that allows a child to so completely absorb and emulate the mother and the father. It's not the imitative, although that is involved also, identification that you see when somebody gets older. This is more profound. It's more primitive introjection. Sorry, I don't know how to say that. And actually, this is part of the way that the ego forms. That the ego develops the capacity to manage the demands of reality, partly by watching that in others and emulating that and connecting to it and introjecting it. Narcissistic identification. This would be part of what you see in the phallic stage with the identification with a same-sex parent. You know, that I am like daddy because I'm a boy and he's a boy, or I am like mommy because she's a girl and I'm a girl. And that fosters an increased intimacy of connection there, and fosters movement in that direction toward that person, toward becoming like that person. And some of that is on the level of awareness, but you got to keep in mind some of this is happens below the level of awareness. The child might not ever actually have the explicit thought, I'm a boy like daddy, or I'm a girl like mommy, and therefore I will kind of cling to him or cling to her. It may happen below the level of awareness. Narcissistic identification also can be a way of managing the distress, the sense of loss, the sense of emptiness that occurs when you lose an important love object. Now that can be a literal loss, like in the sense of somebody dying or leaving, but it can also be loss in the sense of growing up and growing apart from them. I know I was very aware of it in the years after my dad died, where I became much more cognizant of, aware of the ways in which I shared mannerisms and beliefs and ways of doing things, and it didn't bother me like it did when I was young. You know, I had somebody say, "Oh, you're just like your dad." No, I'm not. You know, but after he died, it was a way of almost holding on to who he was, incorporating part of who he was and recognizing it in myself, and being not only okay with it, but liking it, feeling gratified when somebody would point something like that out, and not ever feeling that prior to the loss. So narcissistic identification. Part of the narcissistic identification is I'm building myself up by connecting myself with you. I'm shoring up something in myself. And then goal-oriented identification, which is probably the most secondary, the most mature, the most sophisticated of these identifications. And this would be, I feel inadequate in this situation. I see you as competent, and therefore I'm going to pattern myself after you. This can be conscious. It's generally not conscious. It's generally, we do it without even realizing that we're doing it, right? I remember retrospectively, I didn't know I was doing it at the time, but every athletic guy of my generation who played basketball, you can see the way, particularly if they're a decent athlete, you can see a little bit of Michael Jordan in them, because we watched him and we emulated him, even if we didn't realize that's what we were doing. You as a little kid, you read books or you watch movies, and you find yourself trying to be like the characters in those books and movies, and you're trying to be like those characters in those books and those movies because they embody something that you don't feel. A level of competence, a level of courage, a level of strength, whatever, that you don't feel. I think this might be the last of the defenses that we'll discuss. Sublimation. Sublimation is generally talked about as being the highest or the most sophisticated of the forms of defenses, partially because it's almost inevitably a good thing. And this is basically taking a problematic urge and redirecting it in a way that is socially acceptable. And the classic example of this is what you see with surgeons, sometimes with lawyers also. These tend to be people who are very driven, very intense people who have a fairly well-developed aggressive drive. And they redirect, surgery being the classic example, they redirect that aggressive drive into doing something that they're very well paid for and is very well respected. And you have to acknowledge doing surgery, actually using an edge, actually using a scalpel to cut somebody's body open, in this case to help them, it may be beneficial, but it is still aggressive. So this would be displacing an urge from a problematic object onto a desirable object or a desirable goal. We often think of careers in these terms, art, music, that we take our pain and we express it differently, right? Or we express it through our music or through our art or through self-improvement, right? So sublimation is taking this, so you're not denying the energy, you're not just squashing it down the way repression does. You're actually discharging the energy, but you're doing it, and you're not just letting it go, you're actually letting it go in a direction that's going to help you or help somebody else, or ideally help both of you. So sublimation. And then real quick, I just want to, I'm at these last 4 slides, I just want to throw out a classification from a guy named Valiant, which is kind of a helpful way of thinking about the defense mechanisms. And we're kind of already referring to them as primary and secondary, so we're already kind of alluding to his classification. But he actually further broke it down into pathological, immature, neurotic, and mature. And he saw the psychotic denial and delusional projection, which we've already talked about. Psychotic denial is just the absolute refusal to accept reality. And delusional projection, which is seeing in somebody else something that is not there, that is in fact something that you cannot tolerate in yourself. Both of those are not reality-based. They are, and they never are productive. There's not a good circumstance where you psychotically deny something or delusionally project something. It's always a bad thing, so it's inevitably pathological. And then he talked about immature defenses. So defenses that don't tend to be productive, but aren't necessarily pathological, but they don't tend to lead toward forward movement. So fantasy, just the withdrawal. Projection. So this is a situation where I have discomfort with my level of aggression, and there's a guy over there, and he's got a sleeve, and his head is shaved, and he's wearing leather, and I'm afraid of him because he's an aggressive guy. And that may or may not be true. There's some basis culturally for perceiving that guy that way. So that's projection that's not completely delusional, especially if the guy's glowering at you because you're staring at him because you're afraid of him. He's glowering at you. Okay, now it becomes even more realistic to project that onto him. Passive aggressiveness, which I did not even cover as a defense because everybody knows what passive aggressiveness is. It's a way of discharging your aggression in such a manner that you're not blamed for it. That you're acting out aggressively but indirectly. And then, of course, acting out, which I also didn't talk about, but acting out would be kind of a form of displacement. I'm angry and resentful of my parents, and so I go out and I destroy property by tagging it, by doing graffiti all over it or something like that. Or I act out, I'm angry. I'm angry at mom and dad, and so I go and I displace that onto a teacher. I discharge the emotional energy associated with that, with some problematic object, by redirecting it somewhere else. So acting out is often a displacement, but it's you're directly expressing whatever the problematic urge is. You're just expressing it somewhere else. The neurotic defenses. So these are you'll notice all except for he kind of takes, and now I'm looking at it, he takes some that we would generally characterize as primitive or primary, and some that we would characterize as secondary. And essentially what he's what he's doing here is these are generally cognizant of reality, but they tend to be inefficient, and they tend to like in the case of repression and reaction formation, they take a lot of energy. Displacement, it tends to cause problems. It tends to displace the problem from a really problematic source into a safer source, but there's still a problem, right? I'm angry at you and I take it out on this person. Okay, I don't have a problem with you now, although the anger is probably still there next time you're around them. Now I have a problem with this person who probably is weaker than me. Intellectualization, you can analyze all you want, but if you don't deal with it, it's not going away, right? So defenses that are neurotic. And then the mature defenses. Sublimation, we've already talked about. Suppression, I don't think I had a slide on that, but I talked about it. It's conscious, intentional redirection of attention and energy away from something that's threatening. So it's basically the conscious version of repression. Humor, we've already talked about. Altruism. Altruism is taking energy, say anxious energy, and devoting it in a positive direction from which the person is unlikely to gain any concrete benefit, right? So you end up feeling good about yourself. You see altruism often in depressive characters because the depressive characters are wrestling with a sense of being unworthy, a sense of being of guilt, of that they are unworthy, and so one of the things you'll sometimes see from them is they go out and they make an extraordinary effort to do good things and create good in the world, often without receiving anything in return. And of course that's because they feel inadequate and unworthy and guilty, so they don't, of course they desperately want to receive a reward, to receive comfort, to receive kindness, but they don't feel worthy of it. And then anticipation, this is a good example of, when I said that a defense mechanism can be almost anything you can think of. Well, anticipation is a good example. Anticipation is something that we do all the time, sometimes very consciously, sometimes not consciously, in which you find yourself in a situation and you attempt to anticipate what is going to happen. You plan. You plot. What am I going to do if this happens? What am I going to do if that happens, right? How am I going to manage things in these circumstances? We do this, you're going to have to be around somebody that you don't particularly like, and before you walk into the room, you go, taking a deep breath, kind of, okay, I'm going to hold my temper. That's anticipation. It is a defense. It's a way of managing an impulse. And you can see how it's a mature one because you're aware of the impulse. This sometimes is conscious, it's sometimes pre-conscious, it's sometimes entirely unconscious that you're planning all this stuff. But you have some degree of awareness of the impulse, and your efforts to control it are intentional. So, Valiance classifications, I'm not going to spend a bunch of, that's all the time I'm going to spend on them. I'm not going to spend a bunch of exam questions on them either, but I do want you to have a general picture of kind of how he thought about these different defenses and why he argued for this classification. And that is it for the defense mechanisms. We are going to revisit a lot of this, particularly the idea of primitive and secondary levels of functioning, which we'll talk about as psychotic and neurotic levels of functioning, but that'll correspond to primitive and secondary defenses. Later, when we get talking about the different personality types toward the end of the last third of the semester. So we will be coming back to this. I'll refresh all this in your memory later in the semester.